Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, your host. With us today is military author, game designer, and the editor of Strategy Page, Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us today is columnist, author, and a Strategy Page associate editor, retired Colonel Austin Bay. Welcome, Austin and Jim. I thought it'd be interesting to talk a little bit about human trafficking today. One of the things that I know you talk about all the time, Jim, and probably because you're a Wall Street guy, is follow the money. The human trafficking is bringing in a lot of money to some various evil groups and like that. You've mentioned that Al-Qaeda and ISIS have been funding themselves off of human trafficking. You just wrote a very interesting piece on Libya and how the Libyans are trying to shut down the smugglers and going into Italy and like that. Tell us a little bit more about this money trail.
Yeah, well, but what people forget is that while Libya has been the source of most of the African and Middle Eastern illegals getting into Europe, mainly through Italy, that did not start happening until after Gaddafi was overthrown. Now, this is no virtue of Gaddafi. Gaddafi simply realized that would be letting the smugglers operate would be one more, mark against him, and he couldn't afford anymore. He had basically controlled that because it is, in fact, run by criminal gangs. Often gangs, well, almost always gangs, local gangs with connections in Europe. The intervention of the European Union and various rescue NGOs basically meant that as far as I can tell, the North African gangs could cut out the European mafia. Now, they may still have the connection because basically they would get a finder's fee if the people smuggler, when they got to Europe, they would then, know where to go to get further people smuggling services. It's actually a network of people smuggling services that now cover the world. It's a relatively new business on such a large scale we see now. It didn't really start happening until you had air transport, economical air transport. In other words, 50 years ago. Before that, it was very difficult. You had to get on a ship, and basically it was too easy to be found out, thrown in the brig, and taken back. The people smugglers basically take what the market will bear. That means even people getting up from Africa or the Middle East are paying, depending on where they start, several $1,000s, which is a lot of money. And a major problem in Afghanistan with the departure of all their, a lot of their skilled people is that people with skills, they'll make money one way or the other. And as soon as they get enough together, several of them will start heading off to the West. They'll get through Iran, or, basically not go through Iran, but, whichever way they can. Smugglers will usually take you by several hops. And sometimes they'll let you do it on credit if they have you, how should I put it, in the right kind of vice. The most infamous example of this was the Chinese snakeheads, who are still around but not as prominent. At one point, they were in the news because their idea of a profitable run was to buy an old ship for the last phase, usually, from Indonesia or some intermediary stop, and in some cases just run it aground in the United States. And let the people say, all right, just surrender to the immigration, and they'll let you go. That has been a major boost for the Latin American people smugglers. Again, who pay, basically by how many borders you got to get past. Because until recently, they knew if they could just get you to the border, bingo, you were in, there'd be a little legal bit, and then you'd be let free and you could just disappear. The problem with the people smuggling is that it generally doesn't get noticed, which the people smugglers prefer. They like to do their business in the shadows. The snakeheads got noticed, because they dropped entire boatloads of people off on American shores. I mean, that gets noticed. But they also got noticed because they were a lot of the young women they were bringing in didn't realize or didn't hope they could beat it, so to speak, were turned into prostitutes. Because you had to pay back the debt, which we're talking $10,000, $20,000, $30,000. And if you didn't pay back the debt, these guys were usually connected with an international triad in many cases, the classic Chinese mafia. They would literally threaten to kill your kinfolk back in China. North Korea uses the same technique now, which is why so many people who get out of North Korea and into South Korea plead to be, not identified in any way. That's why one of the latest North Korean hacking scandals involved getting the names and phone numbers of people who had made it to North Korea. So somebody from the North Korean secret police could personally call them up and say, hey, look, if you don't do such and such, spy for us to come back or send or get more money, your mom's going to lose an arm or going to go to the prison camp, which usually isn't survivable depending on how old you are. And this has been actually a great problem for South Korea, because the vast majority of those people getting into South Korea do not want to go back, do not want their family or anybody they know back in the old country harmed. But that's how the game's played, and it's still being played big time, including, for example, a lot of the I think, as the government is trying to point out, but nobody in the mass media is listening, this is still going on with all the people coming in now, especially the kids. They don't come in free, at least not on the Mexican side or the southern side. They have a debt attached to them, and somebody eventually has to pay one way or another.
Austin, do you what's your take on all this?
Well, one of the things that we have followed for now almost 20 years on Strategy Page, but if you look back on several things Jim wrote in the 80s and 90s and a couple of the chapters in the Quick and Dirty Guide to War series, you'll see that crime ties in very closely with terrorist operations and also works tightly with dictatorial regimes. Dictators have used criminal syndicates for forever. Kings have as well. And yes, it's true that democracies make deals with the mafia, particularly the intelligence agencies. But the difference, Dan, is to take North Korea as an example. There was a term that I believe a couple of analysts who wrote for the U.S. Army War College, wrote one of their pamphlets back in the maybe 12, 15 years ago at the Strategic Studies Institute. They coined a term called criminal sovereignty and applied it directly to North Korea, because North Korea has an intelligence bureau, an office that really is a coordinator for international organized criminal operations, some of them directly carried out by North Korean operatives, whether they're intelligence agents or not, they're criminal operatives. Some of them coordinated by North Korean diplomats and intelligence agents with local or regional criminal syndicates. And one of the operations that was fairly well known is the North Korean trafficking, and this is going on in the 1990s, heroin in Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, and Indian Ocean area. They were providing, the North Korean regime was not only providing capital in some cases, money to move it, and then of course they make 10, 100 times what they invested in it when they move it. Providing logistical assistance. There was a story that I never saw confirmed, but I do know North Korea had a couple of ships like this, because one of them finally got boarded, essentially a long-distance trawler that's really a spy ship, but they were using this boat to haul drugs. By the way, one of these ships like this got stopped, too, off of Iran, bringing North Korean weapons about a decade ago, and then it got sent back. They have extra fuel bunkers so that they've got longer range. But one of them was making stops around the Indian Ocean and then would come on back, sail through the Straits of Malacca, come on back to North Korea. Why was North Korea doing this? Well, Dan, it was all about money. The money going through this criminal system. But the high life for the core of the Kim regime. It went for expensive luxuries. As a matter of fact, some of the operation dealt to in acquiring luxury items that and smuggling them back into Pyongyang. Criminal operation. Because they've got a failed system, they're not economically productive, so they're going to go and do it with crime. There's lots of evidence that the Khomeiniist regime, by that I mean the Ayatollah dictatorship that the Ayatollah role of Khomeini really founded in 1979 when he overthrew the Shah, started doing the same thing. Not that the Shah didn't have contacts with criminal organizations. He did. His Savak intelligence agency did. They operate in the Middle East. But nevertheless, it became a money-making venture for the Iranian dictatorship. It certainly grew during the Iran-Iraq war when after Saddam invaded Iran. And now it's become part of the regime's economic policy. I read an article a couple of years ago. Again, some of it was speculative, but you heard what Jim just said about the human trafficking, is that they were engaged in that as well, involved with moving migrants, even from sub-Saharan Africa, because they were using their contacts in some of the Lebanese Shia communities that are scattered around Africa. They do that for other purposes as well. But the human trafficking component to make money, criminal smuggling of of human beings, was part of the regime's business model. We've got 2 or 3 articles that. I've got 2 or 3 columns over the last decade that addresses all of those, including one on criminal sovereignty that ran in, I think, November of 2017. Provides even more details on it. I want to add one other comment, too, about crime and human smuggling. There's a column I wrote in 2001 that is, and I'll tell you why I'm mentioning this. Jim says, well, it's accelerated now that you can move people more rapidly, and you've got air connections and the like. But this column was about a real old-time slaving operation in West Africa. The evidence on this was solid. A couple of major investigative news organizations in the U.S. They were still doing that down in 2000, 2001, but had followed up on these rumors, and basically this old-timey tramp steamer was picking up young West Africans who had been kidnapped by criminal gangs, and then moving them up the coast to cities where they were sold to work. Some of them were even brought up to as far north as Morocco. Now it got intercepted, and it became something of a cause célèbre very briefly. But there it was, and it was. This wasn't a bunch of British and Spanish and Portuguese slave traders. They were West African gangs. Essentially, I mean, the model would be something right out of the history of the transatlantic slave trade. Young men mostly, but young girls as well, kidnapped from interior tribes, tribal or villages, but they're tribes that live on the interior, and brought out and then hauled up the coast and literally sold. So that type of slaving hasn't totally disappeared. Matter of fact, about 4 years ago, I read an article that mentioned someone else had been caught trying to do that in West Africa. Is that criminal? Of course it is. It's supposed to be illegal, but it goes on. And there it was not something connected to an authoritarian regime or a dictatorship. Wasn't necessarily connected to a huge international drug trafficking ring. It was just, as Jim has said of some of these instances that we talk about, it was kind of carrying on a local tradition, as bitter as that sounds.
Jim, what is the particular issues with what's going on with Libya and Italy? Why is Italy the point that they want to drop all of these people off at?
Well, Italy is the closest to the Libyan coast. That's one reason why Libya used to be an Italian colony. I mean, it's literally, geography is everything. The other thing was, until a new government got elected in Italy recently, the Italians refused to basically back away from the EU. If they hit ground, you gotta process them, and et cetera, because a lot of these people were going through almost all these people were going through Italy and causing a crime wave and additional expense for local communities. You got the same problem in Germany, where the current government is faced with collapse because Bavaria, which is again geography, which is the easiest place for people to come up from the Balkans or Italy, is basically fed up, with being the doormat, so to speak, for all the illegals. And then, of course, you have the crime problem and the terrorism, which the Europeans basically go out of their way to deny even exists. Although it does very much so. In fact, it's outrageous in Germany. They do occasionally publish statistics, but not on the front page. But they have an enormous problem with, assaults on, especially on women, murders, and of course the German intelligence has known since the 80s that a large percentage of their Muslim migrants, including many of the second or third generation Turks, basically are tolerant, favorably disposed towards Islamic terrorism, because they believe, again, a small percentage, but enough. I mean, if you take, a few percent of, a million, Muslim nationals, residents in your country, that's a lot of people to keep an eye on. And that's what England has been, banging its head against the wall, because they often admit after there is an incident of Islamic terrorism on their, territory, that yes, he was a known terrorist. The media likes to talk about known wolves and unknown wolves. Well, the fact of the matter is, most of the people who commit these crimes are known to be radicalized, are known to be predisposed, but they can't afford to put, a tail on them, 24/7, and all they got to do is boom, go, and boom, you got it. We got it right here in New York several times. The problem is not so much, Islam. It's money, This is a problem which is now being covered more in Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is the major source not only of the funding for this radical form of Islam, but also for the recruits. The majority, or almost the majority, of ISIL recruits came from Saudi Arabia. Why is that? Because they basically turned the educational system over to the Islamic conservatives in the 1970s, faced with basically another, religious uprising, which they've had before. The Saud family, Abdulaziz Saud, basically got control of Saudi Arabia by making a deal with the devil, as we would put it, with the current for group of the Ikhwan, basically a militant radical Islamic group, and he had to kill them all. He said, "Hey guys, cool it," because basically they were raiding into non-Saudi territory, mainly British and French territory, and the British and French back in those days didn't take that kind of stuff, so he basically, killed as many as he could find and told the others, keep your heads down, and they did, but they never forgot. And it's not just what Abdulaziz did; it's what occurs in Islam. If you look at the history of Islam, and we pointed this at it again and again, for about 1,000 years, they've had a problem with holier than now, or more Islamic than now Muslims, basically stonewalling, stopping any progress at all. Now, again, the experts on the West say, "Well, this is political," But what they overlook is Islam literally means submission. It's a form of government that purposely combines civil and religious together, and it's right there in the scripture, along with a lot of the nasty stuff. And you can always find radicals, and most Muslims agree, we'd like to get rid of this, but there's no mechanism. Granted, the Protestants, a lot of other religions don't have a supreme authority, but if enough of the supreme authorities get together, they can suppress it. The problem is, in the Muslim countries, you do not have that. And so you have these uprisings every generation or so. And it's more frequent now because there's more money. It's easier to organize, and it's easier to finance. And it's not going to end until Islam basically goes through a reformation, which the Saudis have been trying, to their credit, to arrange since the 1980s. They don't get much publicity because they don't have much success. But they have been trying, because to them, it's a very real, very personal, it's a family threat. And they're running out of ideas. I mean, the new crown prince, the 30-something, next in line for the throne, he's getting pretty radical, so to speak, in his own way. But he acknowledges that this is our problem. This is why we can't have good things. Why there are so few books published in Arabic, because it's considered, haram, unclean. And you're going to get your book publisher burned down, or your publishers killed. And in fact, the Islamic world didn't even get movable type for a long time, because when it first showed up, it was from the Christians. It was haram. It was unclean, unholy, un-Islamic. We don't touch it. That's where that ends up. Well, you see it.
Now, Austin, the seamier side, it's all seamy, but the just extremely dark side of human trafficking is the sex slave trade.
Yep.
Some of that coming up.
Look, some of this is, as you said, what degrees of ugly, cruel, brutal, dark, they're all pretty damn dark. But all right, go ahead. You want to ask me about sex trafficking?
Yeah, the Islam is participating in this. Not Islam, not as a group, but the Islamic terrorists have been participating in this.
That's the allegation, and there's evidence. You're talking, you're not talking about whole societies on this. You're talking about these terrorist groups that are totally Some of them just totally in bed with their local criminal organizations because that's how they move their supplies. In some cases, they serve as intelligence assets. I'm talking about the criminals for the terrorist gangs on it. Yes, they're not the only ones. There's again, these are not new allegations, and the Iranian government really bristles when this charge is brought up, but some evidence, some of it is pretty dark, very dark, of Iranian operatives who have engaged in mostly moving women out of either Africa or parts of Central Asia, and essentially selling them as prostitutes, and they're moved on to Europe, in some cases Southeast Asia. During the 1990s, late 1990s, there was a lot of focus, of course, on the various Yugoslav wars of devolution and Kosovo War. And that brought a lot of attention, media attention, to these Balkan smuggling gangs, Albanian, some Serb, Serbo-Croat, Greek, Bulgarian. They're not a new phenomenon. They played a huge role in the some of the gangs did in the 1912, 1913 Balkan Wars. They were part and parcel of the special operations that the Balkan League undertook. And don't think the Turks, who were being attacked in the first Balkan War, didn't have connections to these smuggling gangs themselves. They did. What did they smuggle in the 19th century? Guess what, Dan? Mostly women. Selling women into Central and Western Europe as prostitutes. They also moved other things as well, gold, precious, luxury items and the like. But they transitioned into in the 20th century into drug gangs. Not that they weren't always somewhat selling hashish and opium. I don't know why I put it that way, but that's what they were, because from various places in Central Asia and the Middle East. Plenty of hashish and opium users in London in the 19th century, and Paris as well. Marseille. You could go find some of this cropping up in French and British novels, but they moved into the narcotics trafficking that we are now familiar with. That transition after World War I, and certainly after World War II, moving drugs, but they're also moving people. And to get back to the point I was saying about the attention brought on those gangs in the late 90s, a lot of it was moving young Russian women or women from the former Soviet socialist republics to the West because they had no prospects and they thought they were going to go get rich being waitresses, or even some of them were aware that they were going to be prostitutes. Some of them thought they were going to find husbands because there was a quote-unquote find a husband business, initially by mail, but then by the end of the 90s, start of the first decade of the 21st century, by email. And the criminal syndicates were involved in this. Now, children. I'm not an expert on it, but I've read it too, and it seems there's evidence that that they're selling kids, pedophilia in East Asia and Europe. Gangs in South America doing the same thing in the Western Hemisphere, not just bringing them to the United States and Canada, but elsewhere. I've seen nothing that ties it to the primary. When I follow some of this, Dan, because of the tie-in with crime and terror, and also insurgencies. But so if we move into the child element, I can't say that I've seen that directly tied. Maybe Jim knows something on it. But does it occur? Yes, it does, and it's apparently it's hard for police forces, even when they share information on it, to completely shut it down. Though I read again about 2 years ago an article by I believe the fellow was associated with Interpol, may have been one of the directors, and they said that was one of their top priorities was smuggling, human trafficking, women and children. They're aware of it, and there's how do I put this, Jim? International transcultural disgust at it. You can get everybody will, at least the nations, superficially sign on that they want to stop it, but it's still tough to stop. And why is it? Because there's money in it as well as evil, I suppose.
Right. Now, here in the United States, it's coming up through the southern border, mainly.
Not necessarily. Wait a minute, Jim told you about what the Chinese human trafficking operations, and there's some. It's died down a little bit, but if you include the Caribbean as a southern border, and it is, I suppose. Yeah. Okay. I just make that point. That's not all coming from the south.
Right, but you follow Mexico quite heavily, and the cartel activity in this area.
And look, cartels are big to time into human trafficking. They were smuggling people before they were smuggling drugs en masse. Is my view on that. I didn't mean to interrupt your question, but
well, that is my question. Is what is their involvement? How long have they been involved? What type? I mean, again, we've got these degrees of human smuggling. What are the cartels involved with from Mexico and other gangs in Central and South America?
MS-13. There's and I'm blanking out on the other Central American organization. They sure they're engaged in that. There's human trafficking, smuggling people, bringing in the illegal. I can call them migrants, just illegally entering in the United States. Is really an easy thing to do if you're coming from Mexico into Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California. It gets a little tight as you get towards San Diego. It's because it's just huge and it's wild and there's a lot of empty space. And I'm going to tell a little personal anecdote here. Good friend of mine, half of his family came into the United States from Mexico, about between 1908 and 1910, because of turmoil in Mexico. On that side of the family, they happened to be farmers and relatively small businessmen, and they just left because they were threatened by all the chaos of the Mexican revolutions. Matter of fact, he told a story that he'd heard that Pancho Villa was shooting up the entire valley, and they moved lock, stock, and barrel right across the river into Texas. They actually had some relatives over here that'd been here for decades. Nobody said anything to them. Is that illegal trafficking or are they refugees? Next thing, they're all in college and example of him. But it's easy. My point here is it's easy to do. And in contemporary lingo, these people would have been refugees, no doubt about it, because they were middle-class farmers and businessmen and women. And they just, and how many? He estimated there were about 60 people. Extended family, bang, move across, and now they've set up and they're in Texas. That is not what evolves after World War II. You start getting real economic migrants. There are always some activity going on along the border, South Texas, flow of workers on the farms in the Rio Grande Valley, proximity of Mexican towns and cities to South Texas. Matamoros and Brownsville being an example of that, even though Brownsville's not right on top of an agricultural area. But here were the jobs. And we had some programs. I always mispronounce it, but it was essentially a guest worker program where people were documented. After that ended, you had this, the illegal migrant phenomena. All these people seeking jobs who could do the work, now they had no documentation. Now what the story I'm telling now, I have gotten from now retired Texas police officers who work the border. That's when the criminal organizations start really organizing. It's small at first, making deals, and this is I'm paraphrasing what the police officer said. In some cases, making deals with American businesses to find, and they're almost like illegal recruiters. You find guys who can do this, and they would bring them in. And it certainly became more than that, and it has to the situation that we face now. Now you've got organizations, as Jim described the Chinese situation. It's not very different. In fact, it's the same business model. People living and Dan, you know how tough some of these. You're not supposed to say it, but I've spent a lot of time in Central America, and I've seen the poverty firsthand. I've been there and done that. You have to respect somebody that says, I've had enough of this. And of course, they have these authoritarian, whether they're left, right, or whatever, governments, crooked cops. So they want to go to the land of magic, just like those poor Russian girls after the Soviet Union falls, think they're going to get rich in Paris or whatever. The land of magic, here's being the United States. And then the gangs come in, and Jim may have a more recent figure than I. I remember reading about 15 years ago, it was $2,000. I'm sure it's more now.
Yeah.
I'm sure you know it's more now, but it was $2,000. It's probably $5-6 now, depending. And they'll move you from Honduras or Guatemala through Mexico and take you in. How do they do it? Crooked cops all the way to the border, and dare I say it, crooked cops beyond the border on our side of the border as well. It's not just crooked cops, but it's organized now and systematized. I've given you admittedly passing on the story of the first decade of the 20th century, but Mexico had a huge revolution, and there were problems, violence, real shoot 'em up violence even before the revolution exploded. And porous border, nobody out there, very few people out there. A couple of cavalry troops, guys still on horses, fast and open. You didn't have a systematized organization for doing it. And then I went ahead and I described how the business model evolved. There was always somebody who could make a connection for you, and then it became, the phenomenon. There would be a coyote who could help you go north. That's not new, but the systemization because of the jobs and connections, and then getting the migrants to pay. And then the other thing is they're not all coming up here for jobs. We're getting back into some of the other the human trafficking elements, prostitution, criminality, that element as well. So, is it tied to a guerrilla operation? No, but it's tied to whatever you want to call is going on in Mexico, the criminal insurgency, which is a term we use on strategy page. That doesn't quite get it, but it gets enough of it. It's certainly part of the cartel war. But the real genesis of the cartel war is Mexico's lack of strong judicial and police systems. Clean. The internal corruption is what feeds the war, and also overwhelmingly depresses the majority of the Mexican people. Mexico has plenty of good polling services, and you'll see these 75, 80% of the country saying we're sick and tired of this, and we're sick and tired of our own politicians and police robbing us. They're anything but stupid. No, they know what's going on, and they're desperately cynical about it. See, that's part of some of these the situation in Mexico. It's understood. Here in the United States, unfortunately, our own politics and certain political interests in the United States have to turn this into I try to turn it into a racial, ethnic collision. And if you see really what's going on in Mexico, you're dealing with a huge, powerful, and wealthy place on the planet, which is what Mexico is comparatively, that has a very crooked judicial system, and that is because of the way the political. That's because of the political system, and that allows large criminal organizations to gives them a great deal of space to operate.
Right, and they take advantage of wherever they can.
That's it. And here you asked me about the human trafficking and the women and children on it. That's a minor part of their business model. It's just one that's particularly ugly. Right. I think I used the word evil. It is evil. Evil. But then some of the other things they engage in are as well. And then I don't want to presuppose what Jim's going to say, but I've heard him say this. Austin, some of these gangsters in police uniforms and the like, they've been doing that for 3 centuries. Yeah, he's right. But
so you want to bring us to a conclusion, Jim, on the human trafficking problem around the world?
Yes, I think the how should I put it? The pot of gold countries, the West, in effect, have to basically face up to the fact that what is going on. A lot of the laws that allow people to easily, put down roots, as it were, once they get into the country illegally, are based upon offering asylum to oppressed people. Now, technically, anybody coming in from these countries is doing it because they're oppressed, but most of them are doing it because they're economically and not personally, politically oppressed. In other words, they don't like the system. The problem is they're bringing the system with them. And this is nothing new. In the 19th century, the poorest Italian migrants could only afford a ticket to North America. The wealthy ones went to Argentina. Well, that's another story, but Argentina was very prosperous for a long time. And so it wasn't. But in North America, I've had God knows how many, I grew up in a, Irish-Italian, neighborhood. And the old timers would say, the biggest problem with getting into the United States was not getting past Ellis Island. It was a lot of the gangsters, the people they were trying to get away from, came also. And so you had the mafia. And of course, the majority of Italians hated the Black Hand, whatever you want to call the gangsters, because that was what they were getting away from in Italy. Now, eventually, it took a couple of generations, but they did. But same with the Irish. they were ferociously, anti-British. Ireland had been occupied for centuries and what have you, and that was a big problem with law enforcement. Irish immigrants were getting it legally. They had to go through, a lot more than immigrants have to go through now, but they could be bullied into joining these Fenian organizations. And at one point, they tried to invade Canada, but there was a lot. These were gangsters. I mean, there's no other way to put it. And so this is a problem as old as, migration in general, but especially in the United States. But now it's basically a lot easier. You can do it on a massive scale. And the biggest problem with it is the corruption in the United States. In 1986, there was a solution to all this with, making it illegal to hire, people who couldn't document their migration status, their citizenship status, and what have you. And that was not only ignored by most businesses, they did that because after the law was enacted, Congress wouldn't, basically enforce it. The government wouldn't enforce it. So whose fault is it here? It's basically, a collective outlaw response to a problem that really needs addressing. It can be addressed, but, unfortunately, there's a lot of people in the West, in the United States, who are fine with illegal, migration and all the crime and pain it entails, because whatever, who knows? I'm not going to get into that.
Right. All right. Well, we'll wrap it up there.
Dan, let me make one comment on that. All
Okay.
Right? That story I told about my friends, really grandparents, great grandparents, they're refugees. Revolutionary gangs are burning down all the farms. And they're educated. They already had family in Texas. 50, 60 of them move in mass. That's a refugee situation, which is what Jim is pointing out, that the laws here in the Magic Land, the land of gold, were formulated. That's how they were framed. But that's not the same situation we face right now. You have organized gangs moving people, and those were people fleeing so that they didn't get burned as well. See, so
right.
All right. Okay, there is a difference. Bye, guys.
We'll talk to you next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.